Got a very interesting testimony coming up right now. Um, Brother Bob Gray. And just because you received Christ and there's your testimony, how I received Christ, hey, that's not the end of your testimony, okay? And we're going to find out right here.
Okay, we are on. So when Charles asked me to give my testimony here, I thought, well, that's pretty easy. I've done that before. But I stopped and thought about it. I says, time to take another look at what led to my getting in and getting out of Jehovah's Witnesses. And it was kind of an interesting journey for me. Now, I was a Jehovah's Witness for 22 years. I started studying in the late summer of 1973, and I stepped down from being an elder and started fading out of meetings in early 1995. Just a little history. I grew up in a congregational Sunday school. Now, my dad was a fourth-generation Christian Science. And it was interesting because years later when we got to talk about this, I says, well, we have a propensity for joining cults in this family, don't we? My mom was very non-religious. You could not talk to God about her. She was one of those, it's a private thing, I'm not going to talk about it. I remember in Sunday school being less than 10, because we still lived in a house that we moved out of later. I remember thinking about and anticipating the return of Christ. And later at age 15, I have a cousin who went on to be a Methodist minister, and she says, oh, I've been going to this Advent Christian church camp up in the lake. You'd really like it. I went up there, went there for 4 years. I think it was year 3 when I was 15, I accepted Christ. Now, it's interesting for me because when I became a Jehovah's Witness, I had to, in order to be a witness, I had to reinterpret that event. I had to really deny that event for the 22 years I was a Jehovah's Witness. And I really denied and reinterpreted it for years afterward. I actually thought about going into ministry. I was 15 in 1965. About 1966, 67, being a later teenager and it being the 1960s, I get into a lot of illegal substances, as did many of my contemporaries. Later on, I went into the Coast Guard. I served 4 years in the Coast Guard. Got out of the Coast Guard, got a job at a local cable television company. I guess I was Bob the cable guy for a while. There was a guy named Jimmy there, and I didn't know he was a Jehovah's Witness. I just knew he was talking to people about the Bible, except for me. Talked to everybody but me. And I'm like, what's this guy up to? And in retrospect, it was probably the long hair and the drug-crazed look in my eye that might have put him off just a little bit. But I made up some lame question about the Apocrypha or something just to draw this guy out, find out what he was made of. And he gave me the little blue truth book, The Truth That Leads to Eternal Life. I took it home, I devoured it that night, and almost immediately felt that I had found the real truth. I think back, that scares me to death, that I fell into it that easily. And it's funny, even though the individual witnesses that might be studying with you don't know all the buttons, it seems through their study program and all of that, they hit everybody's buttons. The two for me were Revelation 11:18, Jehovah will bring to ruin those ruining the earth. And I was kind of a frustrated hippie type of character, into the environment, so yeah, God's going to take care of them. And the other one was God destroying the governments. The Vietnam War was still going on. I chose joining the Coast Guard over going to Canada at the time. My then girlfriend, now wife of almost 45 years, didn't like the idea of going to Canada, and I didn't like the idea of going to prison, so I joined the Coast Guard instead. That was a good experience for me. So my wife and I were 2 of over 800 people that were baptized at the Narragansett Racetrack in Pawtucket, Rhode Island on July 5th. You know that, don't you? Yeah, it's long gone now. July 5th, 1974. So over the next 2 decades, as I progressed in the truth, I qualified for privileges, two phrases that ex-witnesses know well. And I really believed it. I really believed that this was the truth. Now, the problem was, as much as I believed, I really didn't like field service. I really didn't like going door to door. It just wasn't, as much as I believed, I didn't always feel like I fit in. And even in high school, I wasn't one of the cool kids. So, and I guess as a Jehovah's Witness, I wasn't either. And the other thing, I didn't always feel like I was doing enough or that I wasn't doing it for the right reason. By 1993, I had 10 years as a ministerial servant, 9 years as an elder. The first 5 years I was an elder, I was also a regular pioneer. So I had 1,000 hours a year to make, and I quit a perfectly good engineering job, bought in half of a business of roofing and siding, and that was just a horror show. But I was able to pioneer. Let me tell you my schedule then. I had to write it down so I could keep track. So Tuesday, Wednesday, and Saturday were my service days. I worked Monday and, I threw Friday in there too. I worked Monday and Thursdays in my office. Wednesday was my big day. I started street work at 7:30, downtown Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I'd go to the meeting for service at 9. We'd do door-to-door in the morning, break for lunch at the Kingdom Hall, go out in the afternoon, do return visits. I'd go home, have dinner, and then I had at least one Bible study, what we called a Bible study, after dinner. And this was one we went on forever, so I got a lot of hours out of that thing. Tuesday night was the service meeting, in which I usually had a part, if not also a school talk. Thursday was the book study, so I was conducting a book study. Sunday, I was the Watchtower study conductor, and probably 1 week out of 5 or 6, I had a speaking assignment either in my own Kingdom Hall or in another one in our circuit. I was running ragged, but I still didn't feel like I was doing enough. And I never stopped and thought, okay, how much is really enough? And if you had asked me at the time, or accused me of being works-based, no, I'm not works-based. We do this out of appreciation. But it really is works-based. Well, as time went on, two things kind of started to bother me. And any of you I've talked to, I've probably already told you this, but the first one was I realized we weren't raising up spiritual people. One of the things that frustrated me as an elder is when people came to me and say, Brother Gray, just tell me what to do. And I was like, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I might take you to the Bible, show you some verses so you can make a good decision. But we didn't seem to be equipping people for any sort of spiritual life. We were raising up organizational worker bees. And I used that phrase for years before I started keeping bees. And if you're a beekeeper, two things. First of all, you can't be a beekeeper and be an evolutionist or an atheist. If you are, you're just terminally unobservant. Bees have this great ability that I think they might have learned from the military. They've learned the ability to look like they are doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing. Either that or they're faking it really well. I mean, you pull a frame out of the hive and they're all busy. They all look like they know what they're doing. And I don't know if they do or not. But the second thing that really started to bother me was that I realized that the training I was getting as an elder, more and more of it was geared toward protecting the Watchtower Society and its assets, rather than really helping people. And when I kind of signed on as an elder, I thought this was all about helping the people in the congregation. I really took that whole paradigm seriously. And later on, when I left, in my letter to the elders, one of my goals in writing to them was to try to wake them up to the fact that they're not really scriptural elders. They are agents of a multinational, multi-billion-dollar corporation. And I didn't realize, they always told us that the elders were recommended by the current elder body, and the recommendation went to Brooklyn, and the governing body reviewed it and prayed over it and all of this. The first elder that we had appointed after I was an elder, the paperwork came back, and I noticed who signed it at the bottom. It wasn't the governing body. It was signed Your Brothers Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of New York, Incorporated. So we weren't elders. We were corporate agents. So here I was, 22 years in now, and as much as these things bothered me, leaving was inconceivable. I had 22 years invested in this thing. A lot of emotional, spiritual investment. The other investment I had that, I'm not particularly proud of, was an investment in being right. I didn't tell my dad that I'd left for 2 years after I was gone, because I didn't want to admit to my dad that I'd been wrong for 25 years at that point. So that was an investment in pride, I guess. So I was stuck in an organization and a social structure that I really wasn't believing in anymore. And I later came to realize that the Watchtower Society has a lot in common with the mafia and biker gangs. Yeah, there's no honorable way out. You just don't leave. There's no easy way out of that thing. But God had already planned my escape. And a verse came to mind. It's James 1:17. It says there, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to a change. Every good gift, every perfect gift comes from above. God gives us a lot of gifts. He gives us life, salvation, the church, and sometimes he gives us gifts in the form of people. People who at one point or another, we're on a path in our life, and right now we're talking about that little part of my life between the Watchtower and Jesus. And as I walk that path, other people join me on that path. Some walked with me longer than others. Some are still walking with me. And there are times when God either brings people into our life miraculously, or they affect a miraculous result, or both. And they call these divine appointments. And I love divine appointment because I've had some great ones. The first divine appointment I had in this realm was a guy named Joey. Now, I was on AOL. This was 1993. And I was in a chat room where there were apostates. And some of my brothers and sisters were talking to these apostates. And I counseled some of my brothers and said, these apostates, they're here just to tear your faith down, and blah, 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 blah. So Joey, I lost the time frame a bit, but it wasn't too long after that. For some reason, Joey posted something very uncomplimentary about a couple of governing body members. And I went back and I said, basically, put up or shut up. Well, he put up. And I was like, okay. And in further conversation with him, I found that he just happened to live only an hour from me and only a mile off of my route as I went from my house in Kittery to my contract job in Rhode Island. Now, I'm still an elder at this point. So on one of my trips, I called Joey up and I says, let's get together, local Burger King. And by the way, do you have a copy of Crisis of Conscience? And he says, yeah. He says, would you mind if I borrow it? And he says, no. So we showed up and we talked all along great. and I borrowed his copy of Crisis of Conscience. And again, this is the new one, by the way. David Henke's got them back there on his table. Now, I had met Ray in 1979 when he came to Portland, Maine to speak. And this was just before he was out of the governing body and gone, and I remember all of the hoopla about what a horrible person he was and all of that. After I read Crisis of Conscience, now I've got somewhat of a, besides being a strange mind, I have a legal mind. And I sat on every judicial committee there was in the 10 years I was an elder, except for one. And I read Crisis of Conscience, and that ended that right away. I just couldn't sit on a judicial committee again. So here, I'm kind of in a quandary. And reading Crisis of Conscience struck a lot of chords with me because a lot of what he wrote about I remembered. You know, the Mexico and Malawi thing and blood transfusion and everything else. And I began to pray to Jehovah that these things that I was finding were false. I prayed to Jehovah, help me find the hole in their argument against my faith. The more I looked, the worse it got. So the next people that God brought to me, and it's interesting because God can use anyone. He brought to me the most angry, bitter, atheist, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses I think I've ever met. And a couple of them were from Scandinavia, and I guess being direct is a thing with them. But these guys were just, but what they did was they systematically and effectively dismantled that aura of authority and authenticity that the Watchtower tries to surround itself with. You know, to Rob's point, you know, it's kind of like they swept the house. Well, they did a little more than that, but I'll talk about that in a bit. But at this point, I'm still an elder. And I'm trying to teach around all of the stuff that I was finding out wasn't true anymore. And I was still, you know, I had people in the congregation I was still trying to help through situations and stuff like that. It was actually a year. So after I read Crisis of Conscience, I told my wife about it. She freaked out just a little bit. And so I didn't talk about it for another year, and I didn't step down from being an elder for another year. I thought for a while I could remain an elder and affect some change for good within as an elder. Yeah, no, that doesn't work. So the next people that God joined on my path were the two Joys. The first Joy, Dawn's wife, Joy Vino. Again on AOL, and somewhere on my desk, I've got like an in basket, and I go through it and I file stuff. Well, I've got some emails from 1994 between Joy Vino and myself discussing various spiritual things. And a little while later, I ended up stepping down from being an elder. There's a whole, I actually served as an elder with this beard for a few months. That's a story I'll tell you another time. But after I stepped down from being an elder, I'm still online. All the people I'm talking to are online. And this other woman, Joy Westerfeld, came on. I got talking a little bit, and she said, oh, what's your story? I said, well, I used to be an elder and live in Maine. Blah, blah. She goes, I know who you are. Well, I was still in my paranoid phase. You know, when you're exiting, you know, you want to get out, but you know, I didn't really want to get busted. And so when people say, I know who you are, it's like, okay. I said, well, how do you know who I am? She says, you remember Joy Vino? I says, yeah. She says, she told me about you. And my women's Bible study group and I have been praying for you for months. It's like, that gave me a lesson in divine appointments and intercessory prayer that probably couldn't have been taught to me any other way. A little while later, again in a chat room, I met a lady named Donna. Now, the two Joys and Donna were never Jehovah's Witnesses. They were Christians who felt called to minister to Jehovah's Witnesses. And they fascinated me because I couldn't figure them out. You know, at this point, I could understand why ex-witnesses would minister to other ex-witnesses, but just regular Christians, what's up with that? You know, and I didn't get that one for years. Donna mentioned having lived in Dover. She lived in Virginia. And Dover, New Hampshire is like a town and a half away from me. And still being somewhat paranoid, I says, oh, Dover, Delaware? And she goes, no, Dover, New Hampshire. I'm like, that's interesting. So as I got to know her better, I told her where I lived. And she said, oh, I used to go into church up in Elliott and all of this. And she started sending me, and this is long enough ago, she started sending me cassette tapes of teachings from Elliott Baptist Church and praise music. Now, as a Jehovah's Witness, I didn't know praise music existed. And so I'm playing this music. Now, I had a 45-minute commute. At this point, I'd gotten a real job, and I was commuting from Kittery, Maine to North Andover, Massachusetts. It's about a 45-minute commute. But I was commuting, listening to praise music, and just commuting in tears. You know, it just really hit me. And Donna told me, she says, well, you know, I know you're not ready for the church thing yet, but when you are, you should consider Elliott Baptist Church. We'll put that one on hold for just a second, but many, many others that I met online joined me on that path for various times. And they all seemed to come onto my path with just what I needed at that point in time. At some point, somebody in one of the rooms told me about this crazy bunch of born-again ex-witnesses meeting at this place up in the mountains in Pennsylvania. And they said, well, you know, they're a little much, but it's up in the mountains, and they have some walking paths, and if they get too weird, you can just take a walk. And so I figured, you know, and I told my wife, Shay, I said, you know, if they get weird, we'll just take a walk. In fact, we were paranoid enough, we didn't even stay on site. We stayed in a little motel over in Orwigsburg, Pennsylvania. Well, needless to say, I went, been going ever since. But there on October 25th, 1998, I had an amazing encounter with God that I, at the time, interpreted as my salvation experience. And it wasn't until years later I thought, wait a minute, I accepted Christ back then when I was 15, and I really meant it back then. But this was just an encounter with God that I think he gave me just to welcome me home. It's awesome. Well, 6 months later, I was invited by the Westerfelds, Joy and her husband, Jim. Jim pastored an American Baptist church in Hamburg, New Jersey. They invited us up for the weekend and for me to give my testimony at their church. I hadn't been in a church yet. And we're still kind of, church, I don't know. So we went up and I gave my testimony and we came home. And the next weekend I said, you know, okay, we've broken the ice here. So I says, well, I'll go up to Elliott Baptist. Only one problem. Right next to Elliott Baptist Church was a Jehovah's Witness couple that my wife and I had studied with when they got baptized. And at the time, I had a Dodge Caravan that was a distinctive red color. I'm like, you know, I go up there in the van, they're gonna see me, I'm gonna get busted, I'm not quite ready to deal with all that drama yet. And so I borrowed my wife's very generic green pickup truck and went up there. So I went in, and I'm one of those guys, I'm always early wherever I go. So I got in early, and the pastor, Stan Rockefeller, was just going around saying hi to people. And he come over to me, and I says, he says, I'm Pastor Stan, I'm the pastor here. I says, well, my name's Bob Gray, I'm Donna Elliott's friend. He hugged me, he says, Bob, we knew you'd come. We've been praying for you for months. So, yeah, that was awesome. Now, when people ask me why I left, as someone who was an engineer for 42 years, and I still do a lot of writing code, yeah, I'm just a nerd kind of guy, I'd like to be able to say that I sat down, I looked at all the evidence, I analyzed it, I came to a logical conclusion, and took the appropriate action. No, no, no. You know, when you think, you know, when I look back, it was, and I haven't got a term for this, it's called forensic faith. You know, you don't see it at the time, but when you look back, you see God's DNA and fingerprints all over it. The evidence is undeniable that it was his involvement there that did all this. So if we kind of look back, so Joey opened the door. The angry, bitter, atheist ex-witnesses, they didn't just sweep the house, they rolled a hand grenade in the door and blew up the whole structure of my faith in the Watchtower. But then the divine appointments took a little change. Now the two Joys came by, and Donna came by, and several other Christians, some ex-witnesses, some not, came by, joined me on that path, and gently helped me to rebuild and refurnish the house. That's really what got me out, not my intelligence. I like to think of myself as a smart guy, but that isn't what worked in that case. So needless to say, I'm a big fan of divine appointments. A great book, Bob Jacks and Matthew Jacks, father and son, Divine Appointments. Highly recommend it. So again, back to James. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, comes down from the Father. All of these people, and I'm sure you're thinking about people in your past right now that helped you along your path. They were your divine appointments. So just a couple of things to think about with divine appointments. First of all, recognize their source. Every good gift, every perfect gift comes from the Father. Recognize them for what they are. You know, sometimes we go, oh, that's just, you know, happenstance. Back, I think it was 2 years ago, my church was nomadic at the time, and we rented space in an old brick church in downtown Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And I came out of church, and it emptied, the steps emptied right onto the sidewalk. There was a little plaza there, there's a little fountain that's really picturesque New England. And I came out of church, and I take a right, and there's a guy standing there, black guy with a Bible. And I was going to walk by him, but something just moved me to stop and say hi. I says, hi, my name is Bob. He said, oh, my name's Robert. I said, well, I'm Robert too, but I'm Bob, you know. And I says, were you just in church? I didn't notice you. No, I wasn't in there. I says, really, what are you up to? He says, I'm doing some street preaching. I'm like, really? So we got talking one thing and another, and I mentioned I was ex-Jehovah's Witness. And he goes, I grew up here in Portsmouth with a guy that's a Jehovah's Witness. I said, really, what's his name? He mentioned the name, and I've known him since he was a kid. And so I said, he says, you know, he was involved in a sports ministry, and he was going to New Zealand to some soccer tournament, and they go to these big sporting events, and they do street preaching at these big sporting events. So I gave him my little card, and he looks at it, he starts laughing. I go, what's so funny? Reaches in his wallet, takes out his ID. He's a retired Air Force major. His name is Robert Gray. Different middle initial, but Robert S. Gray, Jr. I'm like, well, that's pretty interesting. I says, but, you know, obviously your dad was Robert S. Gray, Sr. I says, did he pass away some years ago? And he says, yeah. I says, Robert, you don't believe this. 26 years ago, I was doing street witnessing, and I see a black guy walking toward me with a jacket that said Bob Gray on it. I stopped and I says, your name Bob Gray? He goes, yeah. I says, well, that's my name too. Maybe we're related. We had a little laugh about it. It was this guy's dad. Okay? So, okay, that just happened? No. So there's more to the story. So many of you know Seth Richardson. He and his family were in Pennsylvania a couple of years ago. Well, I was on the phone with Seth one day, and I start telling him this story. I don't even get to the punchline of who it is. He goes, you talking about Robert S. Gray, Jr.? I'm like, Seth, come on. How do you know him? He goes, we're in the same sports ministry. So 2 years ago, Seth messages me on Facebook. He says, I'm down here at the Super Bowl. We're having breakfast with the other Bob Gray. So, I mean, that's a pretty extreme example, but recognizing that every good and perfect gift comes from above helps us to see the miraculous interactions that God orchestrates in our lives. We also need to recognize their purpose. You know, God brings different people into our lives for different purposes. You know, some educate, equip, encourage. Some are there just to show God's love, God's power. I had another interesting experience. I did sound at a church that wasn't mine. I knew the guy that was the tech guy there, and he says, would you mind I put you on the sound schedule? I went, you know I don't go here. He goes, no, but I thought you might be interested. It was a big church, 3,200 people. They had 1,000 people in each service. And I had a lot of fun there. The praise team I did sound for had 11 vocalists. I mean, it was a lot of work, but it was awesome. Excuse me. So I went to a prayer meeting there one Sunday, and they had some praise and worship, and then we broke off into prayer groups. And we were just sharing prayer needs, and I said, you know, I'm involved in this ex-witness thing. I'd like prayer for this. And so we started praying, and this was a time I wasn't particularly comfortable with the whole exercise of the gift of the Holy Spirit. And this guy starts praying. All of a sudden, he puts his hand right on my chest, and he goes, you know, I never get visions. He says, but I have a vision for you. I was like, okay. And you'll like this. He says, okay. He says, so I have this vision of 2 cups, beautiful gold engraved cups. There's a big cup, there's a little cup. The little cup is catching, the big cup is overflowing, and the little cup is catching the overflow. From the little cup's catching the overflow from the big cup. And then he says the big cup is inscribed God's love. The little cup is inscribed ministry. He says the trick is don't mix up the cups. I was just like, wow. And so after the thing was over, he was gone. I saw him in the distance at another service, and I've never seen him since. I asked people, he told me his name was Lance. And I asked people, we don't have anyone named Lance here. I'm like, okay. But, I mean, just what I needed at that point, because I was feeling a little stressed. And just this whole idea, your ministry is there to catch the overflow of God's love, not the other way around. You don't make God love you by engaging in ministry. Also, we need to recognize opportunities to be involved. To be involved as a divine appointment where somebody helps you, or a divine appointment where you help somebody else, mutual interchange of encouragement, that type of thing. You know, when God puts somebody in our path miraculously, or has a miraculous effect, we really get to participate. We get to see and participate in a miracle. And everyone that's here is really a miracle when you think about it. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I meet Christians, and I used to be a Jehovah's Witness, they're like, wow, you know, that you came out, you know, and I think sometimes having been out for a while, we may lose the impact of that. But we are all miracles. We got here by more than one miraculous event. We've all been called out of darkness. You know, there's all kinds of darkness in the world. There's Jehovah's Witness darkness, there's Mormon darkness, you name it. But all of us have been called out of the darkness into God's marvelous light. So, as we recognize the source of these divine appointments, as we recognize them for what they are, recognize their purpose, and look for ways that we can be involved in it, we get to be a part of God's miraculous work, and thereby we bring glory to Him. So, oh, that's all right. I'm done. I'm just going to, what am I doing here? Thank you.